Hi readers, welcome back to my channel, Lila Wanders and Reads, and welcome to a book review on The Women with Silver Wings by Katherine Sharp Landick. Sometimes procrastination pays off. I had not intended to do a book review on this, but I just finished it and I just had to speak about it. I had 2 other videos I was planning to record, but now I've completely changed my plan. Not only because of this, but also because I realized that Wednesday is the last day of the month and I'm going to film my reading recap on Tuesday, hopefully, and get that up for Wednesday. That way it'll be done and we can move on to May. But before I get started on the book review, I want to say that a lot of folks, nowadays especially, but I think maybe in every generation, at least to some extent, people like to complain that no one teaches history anymore. Well, here's the thing that I've been saying for a while. There's just too much. This is an American history book, I believe it's for high school, that at least at some point was used in North Carolina. I ordered it offline, and it is thick. And you only have, 45 minutes to an hour in a class each day, if that. It's been a long time since I went to high school. And there's just so much history to learn that you can't get into the specifics in great detail. You have to specialize in something, which is why for me, I've chosen World War II, and I'm really trying to focus on women in war, but also keep it a little bit broad. Now, the reason I brought this out is The Women with Silver Wings is about the WASPs. There is exactly 1 paragraph in here about the WASPs, and I'll read it to you. More than 1,000 women who had been trained as pilots before the war also signed up for duty. They formed the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP. They flew non-combat missions. They transported supplies, moved aircraft between bases, and tested new planes. This freed male pilots for combat missions. Among the first women to sign up to be a WASP was Cornelia Fort. She was a civilian pilot who had witnessed the bombing of Pearl Harbor from the air. And The Women with Silver Wings goes on to tell about that in great detail. And not great detail, but in detail. Afterwards, there's another paragraph just in general about women in the military. And it says, after the war, many expected the U.S. military to dismiss most of the women, but in 1948, Truman signed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act and allowed women to serve as full members of the U.S. Armed Forces, but they still continued to serve in separate units until 1978. And then it also mentions in 2013, U.S. military leaders signed a directive to allow the more than 200,000 women who were serving in active duty military to fill frontline combat positions. So, a couple paragraphs is all you get about women in the military, but 1 paragraph about the WASPs. This is 330 some odd pages about the WASP, and the one criticism I'll say about this before I get on with it is that sometimes there were so many women, it was hard for me to keep track a little bit. But let me tell you what this is about. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Cornelia Fort was already in the air. At 22, she had escaped Nashville's debutante scene for a fresh start as a flight instructor in Hawaii. She and a student were in the middle of their lesson when the bombs began to fall, and they barely made it back to the ground that morning. When the U.S. Army Air Forces put out a call for women pilots to aid the war effort, Fort was one of the first to respond. She became one of just over 1,100 women from across the nation to make it through the Army's rigorous selection process and earn their silver wings. For the remarkable aviators who would become the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs, flying offered freedom, a community of like-minded peers, and a chance to contribute to the war effort, as well as an opportunity to show the world that women pilots were just as skilled and able as men. In The Women with Silver Wings, historian Katherine Sharp Landick takes us into their lives on the ground and in the air. The women ferried pursuits and bombers across the country and trained male pilots for service abroad, work that was exhilarating but dangerous. 38 Wasp would not survive the war. But even taking into account those tragic losses, the program seemed to be a resounding success until, with the tides of war turning and fewer male pilots needed in Europe, Congress clipped the women's wings. The program was disbanded, the women sent home. But the bonds they'd forged never failed, and over the next few decades, damn, I'm starting to tear up, they came together to fight for recognition as the military veterans they were, and for their place in history. I'm tearing up because I teared up at the end of the book. I should make a hashtag I cried at the end. Because if I had just gone on high school history, I would not have really understood the fight that these women and others behind them made so that I could do my job in the military and beyond. And it really just kind of hit me as I was finishing this book up, how significant that was. A word about Cornelia Fort. She was one of the people lost, and it was not to her error. It was a male pilot. They were flying in formation, and he clipped her plane and sent her into a crash that she could not recover from. And that's sad. Didn't learn that in the history book either. You've got to do a deep dive if you want to know more about what people did in history. Initially, in some places, on the bases that they were stationed, there was pushback. Some of the wives were concerned that the women had come out there to steal their husbands instead of fly. Every woman who volunteered for the Wasps or signed up for the Wasps went because they loved to fly or they wanted to fly. Many of the first recruits were already pilots. I don't know about licensed. Don't quote me on that. And one thing that I thought funny is the same thing I've heard about women on the range. It is that they pay more attention and they follow directions and they don't have any arrogance. Well, I'm a hunter. I know how to shoot. So at Camp Davis, General Tunner, I don't remember his first name, said, so even some of the generals were resistant at first until they started working with the women. By this point, Tunner had begun to actively prefer women pilots. Women, I found, would do what they were told to do, he later recalled. The young men we had hired with little military training often found excuses, and generally, I might say, they were not as good. They were not as well trained. They were not as knowledgeable as women pilots. And another funny thing is, I did not mark this and I just thought of it. So there was a bomber that had issues. They finally it was the B-29 bomber. They finally got the issues sorted out, the Air Force, or whatever. But then the men wouldn't fly it. They were too afraid. They had been rattled and had close calls and seen accidents and stuff. So the military brought the women out to pilot the planes and show the men there was nothing to be afraid of. And that was a great part in the story. I really, really loved that. There's so many great parts to this. Catherine Landeck really does a good job of going as deep as she could into the women's lives and giving closure. For example, Teresa, I've already lost her last name. She and her husband kind of joined up together, but of course they were separated. He went into combat. She stayed back in the U.S. And something happens. I don't want to spoil it. And I thought that I wasn't going to get any closure on it, but at the end of the book, she wraps up Teresa's story, and I was satisfied. I also teared up at that point, too, because it was just so moving. So, there were some things that I didn't know, or maybe I had learned at one point and forgotten. I think it's important to note that Jacqueline Cochran is a person I'd read about in a fiction book. She was instrumental in this program, but she also actively worked against it because she would testify that the best place for the woman is in a home, despite being a pilot herself. She had lost a child, and she testifies before Congress that if her child had lived, she would have not been a pilot. So it's kind of complicated. One of the things I didn't know, and I made a remark, this was in my lifetime. President Ford in 1975 signed into law an order directing the service academies to admit women. And in 1976, 157 women entered the Air Force Academy, 119 entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and 81 entered the U.S. Naval Academy. My lifetime, folks. I know it's not some of yours, but this happened in my lifetime. I was like not quite 5 years old. But the military, even after that, didn't know whether women were emotionally stable enough to be military pilots. They were too hysterical, they said. Some of these attitudes remain today. Not long ago, I heard someone say that women made emotional decisions, as if men don't. Women made more emotional decisions than men. As if men don't. Have you ever known a man who got into a bar fight? Emotional decision. We all make emotional decisions. It's best to step back and not, but it is not confined to women. And then, in June 2009, probably in all our lifetimes, Congress voted to give the women of the WASP the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. And I guess this last part, seeing the changes, and it was not just the WASPs, but the WASP worked hard to get their service recognized, because initially they were just discharged and said your service didn't count. So they fought hard to get their service recognized, to get benefits, and it was just so moving to me. And that is why you gotta deep dive history on things that you're interested in. Anywho, I highly recommend this book. It did take me too long to read this. I have been trying to do something. I have been doing something with my nonfiction reading that hasn't really been working. I think what I'm going to try to do next is, for May, is choose a book and read a select number of pages each night, in addition to my fiction reading. I read my fiction too fast anyway. I can slow down. Because I really do want to continue my education on women in war, specifically World War II, but I am doing some deep dives into the women who participated in the Vietnam War. That's inspired by Kristen Hanna's The Women, but also a book that I read about that inspired her. And it made me realize, again, more women fighting so that I could have a chance, and later women could have a chance to be recognized for their contributions to the wars and to the military. Anywho, that is it for me. If you've any interest in World War II, I highly recommend this. Great book. Happy reading.